It happened on a warm autumn night in Charleston. The river outside was so still that the moonlight seemed carved into it. Inside the house, the antique clock in the foyer struck 9 with a sound that used to feel elegant. Tonight, it felt like a verdict. My stepfather's voice had always carried weight, but when he called my name, it didn't sound like a request. It sounded like a command dressed in silk. Ilara. The way he said it made the walls lean in. I walked toward the study, my heels clicking against the polished floor. The scent of expensive whiskey hung in the air thick enough to touch. Gerald Whitlock stood in front of his desk, sleeves rolled to the elbows, his tie loosened, but his control never had been. On the marble table sat a single folder with a gold clasp. Behind him, the light from the chandelier washed the room in a cold yellow hue. He didn't greet me. He just pushed the folder toward me. "You will pay for it, Ilara, tomorrow morning. No delays." His voice was low but sharp like a knife against glass. I opened the folder and saw the number. $2 million. $2 million for my stepsister's wedding in Palm Beach. A wedding that looked more like a corporate acquisition than a celebration. I said nothing. Gerald had always believed silence meant obedience. But this time, my silence was a storm holding its breath. He stepped closer. His cologne hit me first, expensive and suffocating. Then his hand was on my throat. The movement was fast, but not unfamiliar. He squeezed just enough to let me know what would happen if I said no. His breath smelled like whiskey and power. "You've always been the smart one," he whispered. "Now you'll finally be useful." The world narrowed to the sound of my pulse in my ears and the cool marble under my back as he pressed me against the edge of the table. I stared at him. I did not cry. I did not beg. The thing about control is that it stops working when you stop fearing it. In his eyes, I saw a man who believed he owned me. For 35 years, Gerald had treated my life as an extension of his will. He controlled the trust, the family image, the narrative. He controlled my sister Tessa, the princess he polished to perfection, and he controlled me, the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who paid for everyone's mess. But tonight, something shifted. It was not loud. It was quiet, cold, clean. He waited for me to nod like I always had. I didn't. His grip loosened just enough when he realized I wasn't trembling. That was the first time I ever saw confusion flicker across his face. The first crack in the empire he built out of fear. I spoke slowly, my voice steady. "Let go." He hesitated for half a second, then released me with a mutter that sounded more like a growl. The clock struck again. 9:15. I straightened my collar, picked up the folder, and looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a tumor. No rage, just precision. "Tomorrow morning," he repeated. His certainty made me smile. A small, quiet smile that unsettled him more than any scream could have. When I walked back to my room, the house felt different. The same walls, the same art, the same luxury. But the air had changed. It was no longer heavy with his authority. It was filled with the calm that comes right before a storm. I opened my closet and pulled out the old leather suitcase I hadn't touched in years. It slid across the wood floor with a whisper. I packed quickly. Clothes, passport, laptop, a thin stack of documents, and a small wooden box that smelled faintly of cedar. It was not a box for memories. It was a box for endings. Downstairs, I could still hear Gerald pouring another drink. The sound of ice against crystal carried through the hallway like a metronome. I glanced at the security monitor near my door. The camera by the front gate glowed softly in the night. I imagined him tomorrow pounding that same door expecting a daughter. He would find a box instead. As I zipped the suitcase, I whispered to myself. That night, I didn't pack my fear. I packed my freedom. It was the first time in years my voice didn't shake. I lifted the suitcase, walked down the silent hallway, and opened the front door. The night air rushed in, cold and sharp. My heels clicked softly on the stone steps as I moved toward the gate. The only sound behind me was the clock striking again, as if trying to mark the moment history shifted. The security camera caught it all. A woman in a black coat, a leather suitcase, a house that had finally lost its hold. a chapter closing without a single scream. People think freedom is loud. Sometimes it is as quiet as the sound of wheels rolling across wet stone. I did not look back. Not once. I grew up in Charleston in a house where silence was currency and obedience was the only way to keep the air from breaking. When I was 10 years old, my mother died on a Sunday morning while the church bells were ringing. I remember standing on the steps of our home in my navy dress, staring at the way her absence seemed to rearrange the walls. Everything changed after that. My father remarried within a year. Lillian Whitlock arrived like a storm wrapped in silk. She was beautiful in a way that warned you to keep your distance. She had perfect hair, perfect posture, and a way of speaking that made every sentence sound like an evaluation. Along with her came Gerald Whitlock. At first, he was just the man who stood quietly behind her at dinner parties, tall, clean-cut, wearing suits that looked like they came from another world. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone filled every corner of the house. When Tessa was born a year later, the Whitlock house tilted toward her like plants bending toward the sun. Everything revolved around her smile, her dresses, her voice, her future. I became the silent orbit around a star that wasn't mine. At birthdays, she got diamond earrings and front-page photographs. I got the job of setting the table. At Christmas, she opened boxes stacked higher than she was tall. I balanced the checkbook for my father. My reward was being called responsible. That word became a chain I didn't even feel tightening. By 16, I was helping Gerald manage invoices for the family's investment properties. By 18, I was winning scholarships. By 22, I was in Georgetown studying finance, holding the kind of resume Gerald could brag about to his friends. He called me his pride, but only when it made him look bigger. Tessa was never asked to be responsible. She was raised to be adored. Whenever she made a mistake, Gerald fixed it, then turned to me and reminded me how lucky I was to be strong. I learned early that love in this family was conditional and uneven. Tessa's tears were emergencies. My exhaustion was invisible. Gerald called it family duty. Lillian called it tradition. I called it the quiet theft of self. It's strange how people can steal from you without ever touching your wallet. I used to sit on the porch after they all went to bed. The night breeze coming from the river was the only thing in that house that didn't belong to him. I would listen to the crickets look at the lights from the yachts moving slowly down the water and wonder how many of those people behind the glass windows felt like I did, trapped in luxury. I never told anyone how it felt to live inside a life built to look perfect from the outside. But I memorized the sound of doors clicking shut at night, the way Lillian's heels echoed through the hallway like a warning, and the way Gerald's hand on my shoulder felt less like affection and more like a reminder of ownership. When I graduated and got my first real job in D.C., Gerald was the one who drove me to the airport. He smiled the whole way, but it wasn't joy. It was calculation. On the tarmac, as planes lifted into the fog, he leaned close and whispered, "Don't forget who helped you get here." It wasn't a blessing. It was a claim. I carried those words with me like an invisible stamp on my back. No matter how far I went, I was never meant to be free. Tessa stayed in Charleston. She grew up into the kind of woman Gerald could parade. Designer clothes, glamorous parties, expensive mistakes. Every time her world cracked, mine was summoned to fix it. At 27, she crashed a car I paid for. At 29, she opened a boutique that failed within a year, funded with my co-signed credit. Each time Gerald called me with the same phrase, "Family comes first." Each time I sent the money. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself this was how families worked, but each payment was a thread pulled from the fabric of my own life. I remember one evening in Georgetown. I was sitting on the balcony of my apartment with a glass of water and a city view that should have felt like freedom. My phone rang. Gerald's name lit the screen. My stomach tightened before I even picked up. Tessa had maxed out another account. This time, it was a designer wedding planner. She wasn't even engaged yet. He talked about family legacy, about appearances, about keeping our name polished like the brass on his favorite cufflinks. When the call ended, I stared at the lights of the city and realized something quiet but sharp. They were not asking for my help. They were taking it for granted. People like Gerald build entire worlds out of control. They make sure every favor feels like a debt. Every success feels like something borrowed. Every act of rebellion feels like a betrayal. I spent my 20s trying to earn a kind of love that was never real. I mistook survival for loyalty. But somewhere between the late-night balance sheets and the endless wire transfers, a quiet resistance began to form. It didn't roar. It waited. When Tessa announced her wedding in Palm Beach, I knew what was coming before the first invitation was printed. I saw the headlines in Gerald's eyes. A perfect event, a family photo, a new display of wealth, and my signature on the bill. This time I felt something different. Not anger, not fear. Just the steady, cold certainty of a woman who has spent her entire life carrying a house she did not build. Looking back now, the foundation of this war wasn't built in one night. It was built over decades. It was built in the quiet way Gerald made me believe my worth existed only in how much I could provide. It was built in Tessa's soft requests that always ended with my yes. It was built in a house on the river where everything smelled like old money and control. And that is why on this night, when he finally pressed his hand against my throat and demanded $2 million, he believed I would obey like I always had. He didn't know that the resistance he created was already waiting for him. He didn't know that every late night on that porch, every whisper of the river, every quiet moment where I wished to be free, had become part of a storm he couldn't control. That storm had my name on it, Elara Kingsley, and it had been waiting a very long time. Tessa always lived as if the world existed to decorate her desires. When the call came about the wedding, I already knew how it would end. Gerald did not even ask if I had time to fly home. He just said, "We need you in Charleston, tonight." His voice carried the same polished command that had defined my entire life. By the time my plane landed the next morning, the humid air wrapped around me like an old enemy. I had not even stepped into the house before I saw the glossy white envelopes stacked on the foyer table. The invitations had already been sent. The decisions had already been made. My presence was not about choice. It was about payment. Palm Beach. That was the name everyone kept repeating with a kind of reverence. The wedding was not a celebration. It was a performance. The venue was a historical estate overlooking the water surrounded by manicured lawns and imported roses. The cost was obscene, but to Gerald it was a statement. To Tessa it was a dream she believed she deserved. I sat at the dining table while they scrolled through photos of chandeliers and champagne towers, their voices soft and sweet, as if money was just air floating through the room. When I asked how much they had already spent, Tessa smiled like she was telling me about a weekend getaway. "Only $1.5 million, she said. Gerald added without looking at me, "You'll cover the rest. It's family." The rest. $2 million. It wasn't the number that hit me. It was the casual way they assumed my life belonged to their plans. I stared at the marble table, the same one where years ago he had told me my worth. That table had seen the shape of my silence too many times. Tessa leaned forward, hands perfectly manicured, voice soft as velvet. "Elara, this isn't just my wedding. It's our family's name. It's legacy." She always used words she had learned from Gerald, polished words that made theft sound like tradition. I asked her how she planned to pay me back. She blinked confused, like I had spoken in a language she had never heard. She never paid anything back. She didn't have to. Gerald cleared his throat the way he always did when he was about to turn a conversation into a command. "This is not about repayment," he said. "This is about families standing together." His words were heavy with the weight of expectation. I knew them too well. They were the same words he used every time Tessa failed and I was expected to fix it. When I went upstairs later, I found a copy of the loan documents on my bed. My name was on a signature line I had never seen. I traced the curve of the forged signature with my finger and felt something inside me go cold. They had signed my name without even asking. Tessa had taken a line of credit backed by Gerald's company, and he had added my name as guarantor. It wasn't just manipulation anymore. It was a trap. The next day at brunch, Gerald wore his crisp white shirt and the same casual authority that had always worked on me. Tessa wore a silk dress and the expression of someone who has never heard no in her life. The waiter brought mimosas while Gerald spoke about the caterer, the designer, the guest list full of people with names that opened doors. Every sentence was another brick in the wall they were building around me. I said nothing for a long time. Tessa laughed, leaning into me like we were sisters sharing a secret. I know it's a lot, but you make more than anyone I know. It's just numbers to you, right? She said it like she was complimenting me. I looked at her and realized something sharp. She didn't see me as a person. She saw me as an unlimited line of credit with a heartbeat. Her world was built on the quiet assumption that I would always catch her when she fell. And every time I did, Gerald called it love. Later that afternoon, I walked to the pier at the end of the property. The water was calm, reflecting the old oaks that lined the estate. I stood there with the loan papers in my hand and felt the breeze slide against my skin. When I was younger, this view had felt like safety. Now it felt like a cage with polished edges. Gerald had followed me there more than once over the years to remind me how much I owed them. But this time he didn't follow. He didn't need to. He thought the contract would do the work for him. Tessa came out in her silk robe holding her phone like a trophy. She showed me a video of the ballroom they had chosen. Her voice bubbled with excitement. "It's perfect, Ilara. Can't you see it?" What I saw was marble floors bought with my blood, chandeliers, bought with my breath, flowers watered with the weight of my silence. She wrapped her arm around mine like she was including me in something beautiful. But all I could think was how beautiful prisons often are. I didn't argue with her. I didn't tell her how furious I was. Anger would have been a gift to her. She would have twisted it into guilt, and Gerald would have polished it into obedience. Instead, I let her talk until the sky began to turn soft and orange over the river. She never noticed how quiet I was. She never noticed the way my jaw locked as I watched the sun sink behind the trees. She thought she had already won. That night, I sat alone in the guest room. The loan papers lay flat on the desk, illuminated by the soft gold of the lamp. My name stared back at me from the forged signature. For years they had asked. This time they hadn't even bothered. That was their mistake. They mistook my silence for surrender. But silence is not surrender. It is preparation. I folded the papers carefully and slipped them back into the envelope. I didn't tear them. I didn't shout. I didn't throw anything against the wall. I just stared at my reflection in the darkened window and whispered to myself a promise I didn't even fully understand yet. I would not be their solution again. I would not be the quiet foundation under their empire. Not this time. Not for $2 million. Not for a wedding that wasn't mine. Not ever again. The night it happened, the air outside was thick with the kind of silence that hides something ugly. I remember the way the river smelled that evening, sharp and damp like metal and salt. The house was glowing with warm light from the chandeliers, but the warmth had always been a lie. I had spent the day pretending everything was fine, sitting through endless discussions about floral arrangements and champagne fountains, nodding while Gerald and Tessa made decisions for me as if my wallet belonged to them. By the time the sun went down, the pretense had worn thin. Gerald called me into the study just after 8. His voice carried that familiar weight. He never shouted. He didn't need to. His authority had always been the air everyone else breathed. The study smelled like whiskey and old wood. He stood near the fireplace with a tumbler in his hand, the ice clinking softly as if even the drink understood it was part of a ritual. The loan papers were spread out on the desk like evidence of my obedience. Tessa hovered near the door wearing a silk dress and a glassy smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She didn't have to say anything. She had never needed to. Gerald did the speaking and I did the paying. He looked at me for a long time, taking his time the way men do when they're used to being obeyed. "You're going to wire the money in the morning," he said calmly. 2 million, no delays. I told him no. It was quiet, almost too soft to hear, but it was real. The word no tasted strange on my tongue because I had never given it to him before. His face froze in that half smile he used when negotiating with people who didn't matter. For a moment, he looked almost amused, as if this was a game he was still sure he would win. "I'm not asking, Ilara," he said. "This isn't optional. You owe this family everything." It was the same language he had used my entire life. You owe. You must. You will. Something in me shifted then. The years of quiet obedience, of holding everything together, of being their unshakable foundation, finally cracked. I stepped closer to the desk and placed the envelope flat on the surface. "I don't owe you anything," I said. My voice was steady in a way that surprised even me. He moved fast. I had seen him angry before, but this was different. It wasn't shouting or chaos. It was control sharpened like a blade. He grabbed my arm and pulled me closer, his breath hot with whiskey. For a second, the room felt smaller, the air thinner. He leaned close enough for me to see the veins in his temple, the kind of rage that comes from entitlement, not fear. "You think you can walk away from this," he said softly. "You think you can walk away from me." Tessa said my name, but it was barely a whisper. She didn't move. She never did. She had grown up in this house learning to let Gerald do what Gerald wanted. I felt his grip tighten, the weight of years pressing into the bones of my wrist. I stared at him, and for the first time I saw him clearly. Not as the man who raised me, not as the man who claimed me, but as a man who believed control was the same as love. The world slowed down. I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I could smell the smoke from the fireplace, sweet and heavy. I could feel the heat of his hand against my skin. And then something inside me went still. Fear used to be loud. Tonight it was silent. My eyes met his and he hesitated. Just a flicker. But it was there. Because he saw it too. I wasn't afraid anymore. He released me, but the room didn't return to normal. It never would again. Tessa stepped forward, her voice trembling in that practiced way she used when she wanted to appear fragile. "Please, Alara," she said, "don't make this harder." The way she said harder made it sound as if I was the one twisting the knife. She reached for my hand and I pulled away before she touched me. She didn't understand what had just happened. She didn't understand that something had ended. Gerald walked around the desk slowly like a man reclaiming a space that belonged to him. "This family exists because I built it," he said. "You wouldn't have anything if it weren't for me." His words echoed against the walls that had heard too many versions of the same speech. But this time, I wasn't the girl who stood still and accepted it. I straightened my shoulders, felt the ache in my wrist fade into a strange kind of clarity, and said the quiet truth that had been building for years. "I don't belong to you." For a long moment, no one moved. Tessa stared at me as if I had just spoken something unforgivable. Gerald clenched his jaw, his control splintering around the edges. The house felt different now, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. He was expecting me to back down to apologize, to smooth over the moment like I always had. But silence can be louder than shouting. I let the silence grow until it filled every corner of the room. He finally laughed, a low, bitter sound. "You'll change your mind," he said. "You always do." But the way he looked at me told me he wasn't sure anymore. He turned his back as if that ended the conversation. But it hadn't. It had started something else entirely. When I walked upstairs, my hands were shaking, but not from fear. They were shaking from the force of something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Power. Not his. Mine. I closed the bedroom door and leaned against it, letting the weight of the moment settle over me like a storm I had finally stopped running from. He thought he had broken me. What he didn't understand was that this was the night he lost the one thing he had always counted on. My silence. My compliance. Me. The night after Gerald cornered me in the study, I did not sleep. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. I sat at the small desk in my room with a cup of cold coffee and my laptop open. The light from the screen threw pale reflections across the walls. I used to think silence in this house meant safety. Now I knew it meant strategy. If Gerald believed I would obey him like always, he had already lost the war he didn't know he started. I opened the folder hidden deep in my encrypted drive. Years of transactions, trust documents, loan records, copies of forged signatures, wire transfers with dates burned into my memory. I had kept everything. Back then, I told myself it was because I needed order. Now I knew it was instinct. I logged into 3 accounts, one personal, one business, one that no one knew existed except me, and a single attorney in Georgetown. Every number on those screens represented hours I had spent building my life while they were draining it. I moved the funds quietly, shifting them from any account that shared Gerald's name to a private structure he could not touch. Each keystroke felt like a quiet exhale. For years, he had built his empire on the belief that I would never step out of line. I was stepping now. Then I opened the email archive. Thousands of messages every time he had demanded money. Every time Tessa had sent me another receipt disguised as a plea. Every transaction came with a breadcrumb of evidence. People like Gerald never believe their control can be documented. They believe their power is too big to leave fingerprints. But every empire leaves prints. And I had collected them. I uploaded everything to a secure cloud drive with encrypted access only to me and my attorney, Margaret Cole. Margaret had known me since my first year in D.C. She was one of those rare people who understood how wealth and control intertwine like vines. Years ago, she had warned me to protect myself. That night, I dialed her number for the first time in months. It was past midnight, but she answered on the second ring. "Tell me you're finally ready," she said, her voice calm but sharp. I didn't have to explain. She already knew. "I'm ready," I said. There was a long pause, then the sound of paper shuffling on her end. Then, "Let's make this clean." Margaret didn't deal in emotion. She dealt in precision. She walked me through each step with the steadiness of someone who had dismantled men like Gerald before. Freeze the joint trust accounts. Revoke his signatory privileges. Secure my personal assets under a separate legal entity. She reminded me to leave a paper trail so tight it could strangle a lie before it spoke. I followed her instructions like a surgeon in an operating room. Cold, precise, unapologetic. When the financial ground beneath Gerald started to shift, he would not feel it right away. That was the point. Control only works when the other person doesn't know it's already gone. I filled a small wooden box with the kind of evidence that doesn't whisper. It screams. Certified copies of every forged signature, loan contracts, photos of documents with his handwriting, USB drives with recordings of his voice. A short letter handwritten placed on top of everything. I wrote only one sentence. "You taught me control. I learned it better." I sealed the box with clear tape, pressing it flat with my palms until the edges bit into my skin. It wasn't rage that fueled me. It was something steadier, the kind of resolve that comes when fear has finally died. By 2 a.m, I was at the closet pulling out the black travel case I kept for business trips. This time, it wasn't business. It was an exit. Clothes, laptop, external drive, passport, a single photo of my mother and me at the lake. I left behind everything else, the dresses, the shoes, the furniture Gerald had chosen. None of it was mine. It never had been. Before I walked out of the room, I checked the house security system from my phone. The cameras would record every step Gerald took when he found what I left behind. I wanted him to see himself open that box. I wanted him to remember the exact moment the control he believed was permanent slipped through his hands. Outside, the air was heavy with mist. The oaks along the driveway looked like black silhouettes reaching for something they could never touch. I walked down the hallway in silence, listening to the soft echo of my steps. Every room I passed felt smaller. The walls that had witnessed years of quiet obedience now felt like hollow shells. When I reached the front door, I paused and looked back at the study. I could almost see him standing there in the morning, confident, certain of my compliance. He would find silence instead. I placed the box on the porch exactly where he would see it first, right in the center of the welcome mat. The irony wasn't lost on me. This house had never welcomed me, but it would give him a message he couldn't ignore. My flight was at 6. I booked it under a different LLC months earlier when I first allowed myself to imagine escape. Nantucket, a place where the air smelled like salt and no one knew my name, a place Gerald would never imagine me choosing because it wasn't part of his map. I walked down the path toward the gate with the suitcase rolling softly behind me. The sound was almost gentle. The night did not care what I was leaving behind. At the end of the driveway, I stopped beneath the iron archway. For a second, I let myself feel everything at once. The years of silence, the manipulation, the endless nights counting numbers that didn't belong to me. And then I let it go. I stepped out onto the street where the driver waited. As the car pulled away, I watched the house shrink in the rearview mirror. It looked perfect in the darkness. Gerald had spent years perfecting that illusion. But illusions are only powerful until someone stops believing in them. I pressed my hand against the cold glass of the window and whispered to myself, "It's over." At the airport, I moved through security like a ghost. No one recognized me. No one cared. The announcement for my flight crackled through the speakers, indifferent and clear. I sat at the gate with a coffee warming my hands, the weight of the suitcase beside me. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying anyone else's burden, only my own. I checked my phone. No calls. Not yet. But I knew what the morning would bring. The moment he saw that box, he would realize something was different. Gerald believed control was permanent because no one had ever walked away from him before, but everyone has a first time. As I watched the lights on the runway flicker in the mist, a calm spread through me like quiet water. This was not revenge. Not yet. This was the ground shifting beneath his feet. This was the storm he built without realizing it. I didn't run. I repositioned the pieces, and soon he would have to play a game where I had already made the first move. The morning after I left Charleston woke under a sky the color of pale stone. I was already sitting at the small gate cafe in the Nantucket airport when the camera notification flashed across my phone. It was 9:15, right on time. Gerald had always been a man of schedules, a creature who believed the world bent itself around his clock. I opened the feed, the soft hum of travelers around me fading into the background. The porch of that house appeared on the screen, sunlight slanting across the marble steps. And there he was, Gerald Whitlock in his tailored navy suit, the kind he wore when he intended to command a room. Tessa stood behind him in a white silk blouse, clutching a designer bag like it could save her from what was about to happen. They expected me to be waiting inside. They expected compliance packaged in a daughter's voice. Instead, the only thing on that porch was the wooden box I had left in the center of the welcome mat. The camera caught the slight frown on Gerald's face as he rang the bell once, twice, then hit the door with his palm. Alara, he called his voice, carrying that command I had once mistaken for power. He waited, expecting footsteps. There were none. He bent down his polished shoes, glinting in the morning light, and picked up the box like it was a minor inconvenience. He didn't know yet that it was the moment his empire started to collapse. He tore the tape with a practiced impatience, as if even this rebellion would yield to him eventually. When the flaps opened, the first thing he saw was the stack of certified documents, each one with his name on it. His face didn't move at first. Control was a habit for him. But I saw it in the way his hand tightened on the edge of the box. A small tremor, a hairline crack. Tessa stepped closer, her voice low and shaky. "What's in there?" she asked, like a child who doesn't understand that fairy tales can turn into courtrooms. Gerald didn't answer. He kept flipping through the pages, scanning the signatures, the transfers, the evidence. The morning light reflected off the gold clasp on the top file, a small, cruel shimmer. I had spent years holding this evidence in silence. Now it was speaking for me. Then he found the USB drive. I watched him turn it over in his hand, confused, suspicious. He plugged it into the small speaker system on the porch. My voice filled the air. It was calm, steady, stripped of the tremor he had taught me. "You taught me control," Gerald, the recording said. I learned it better. What's inside this box isn't revenge. It's the truth. And the truth has receipts. Tessa gasped. I saw her on the feed covering her mouth, as if that could hold back the world crumbling behind it. Gerald didn't move. He just stared at the box like it had teeth. His jaw flexed, that familiar tick he tried to hide when things slipped beyond his grasp. He lifted his head slowly and scanned the street as if I might appear out of nowhere and take it all back. But I was hundreds of miles away sipping coffee that tasted like salt and wind. He finally spoke a low growl slipping through clenched teeth. She thinks she can walk away. But this time there was no audience who believed him. Tessa's voice cracked. "What are we going to do?" she whispered, her hands twisting around the straps of her bag. He didn't answer, because for the first time he didn't know. The camera caught the moment he sank down on the step, the box between his knees papers scattered like confessions across the porch. He had always looked taller than everyone. That morning he looked smaller, not because his body had changed, but because the illusion had. Power built on fear only works when the other person stays afraid. I wasn't afraid anymore. I leaned back in the chair at the cafe, the sound of boarding announcements humming faintly above me. Around me, people were living ordinary lives, rushing to flights, stirring sugar into their coffee, checking their watches. No one knew a man was unraveling on a porch 1,000 miles away. But I did, and I had never felt calmer. Tessa knelt beside him on the screen, her perfect hair catching the light. She reached for the papers, but he pulled them away like a drowning man clutching at driftwood. The control he had wielded like a weapon was slipping through his fingers in real time. His empire was built on silence, on mine, and silence was no longer his to command. I closed my eyes for a moment and breathed in the smell of fresh coffee and ocean air. This was the part of the storm I had imagined for years. Not loud, not cinematic, just quiet and exact. A man who thought he could own me facing a box that told him he never did. The boarding call for my flight echoed through the terminal. I glanced down one last time at the camera feed. Gerald stood shoving the papers back into the box like a man trying to stuff smoke into a jar. Tessa followed him, her heels clicking against the porch as they disappeared inside. The camera caught the door closing behind them. But I knew it wasn't closing on me. It was closing on everything they had built on my silence. I turned off the feed. The world outside the airport window stretched wide and blue, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have to look over my shoulder to know someone was waiting to collect my life. They could have their house, their parties, their borrowed power. I had something they could never reclaim, my freedom, and they had just opened the box that proved it. By the time the sun began to set over Charleston, the silence inside that house had already started to fracture. Power never collapses in an instant. It unravels thread by thread, and Gerald Whitlock had just pulled the wrong one. I was sitting by the window of a small guest house in Nantucket when the first call from Margaret came in. Her voice was crisp and efficient the way it always was when the law started to move. "It's happening," she said. Those 2 words were enough. I could almost hear the sound of gears grinding into motion hundreds of miles away. She told me the trust accounts were frozen within the hour of his attempted access. The bank flagged the forged signature I had documented years ago. A quiet red flag had turned into a siren. Gerald had built his reputation like a monument. Old money sharp suits the illusion of permanence. But the legal system doesn't care about illusions when the paperwork is precise. He tried to transfer funds that morning, probably to cover the damage, maybe to clawback control, but the accounts bounced. No access. No leverage. Margaret's team had already filed the preliminary report with the federal district court. It contained everything: signatures, email chains, voice messages. His empire was a beautifully polished lie, and now every piece of it had a date and a witness. An hour later, my phone buzzed again. It wasn't Margaret this time. It was a news alert. The Charleston Business Chronicle had published a short, carefully worded article. Local developer under financial review. They didn't use his name yet, but they didn't have to. In places like Charleston, everyone knows which developer holds which riverfront estate. The article mentioned irregularities in trust funds, whispers of forged authorizations, and an ongoing investigation. It was enough to start the fire. I opened my laptop and watched the story spread. Other outlets picked it up. Real estate forums, local gossip pages. People who had once smiled at him at fundraisers were now dissecting the details like vultures circling a carcass. Wealthy circles are loyal only until the first crack appears. Then loyalty evaporates like cheap perfume. Margaret called again, her voice lower this time. "He's furious," she said. And scared. He called 3 lawyers in the last hour. All of them told him the same thing. "This isn't going away." She paused, then added, "The bank has initiated a mandatory audit." That word audit felt like a weight sliding off my chest. Gerald had hidden his control behind polished contracts and silent compliance. But an audit is a light, and light doesn't ask permission. I thought of him sitting in his study, the place where he had always dictated the rules. Only now the rules were being rewritten without him. Tessa would be panicking. She had lived her whole life on borrowed power and borrowed money. The moment that power stopped flowing, the world she knew would start to rot at the edges, and she would realize that she never had a plan because she never needed one. The third call came at dusk. Margaret again. "He's trying to contact you," she said. "I have his lawyers on the line asking if there's a settlement. I told them there's nothing to settle." She sounded almost satisfied. She had watched too many powerful men crumble under the weight of their own arrogance. I walked outside to the small porch overlooking the water. The air was cool and smelled of salt. I let the sound of the wind fill the silence. I wasn't celebrating. It wasn't joy. It was something cleaner, a steady pulse of clarity that felt almost foreign. For years I had imagined what it would feel like to see him lose control. I thought it would be loud, explosive. But power doesn't fall with noise. It falls with the quiet realization that no one fears you anymore. In Charleston, the whispers were turning into statements. A friend from Georgetown texted me a screenshot of a news banner. This time, his name was there. "Prominent developer under federal investigation." Underneath it, a photo of Gerald smiling at a charity gala hand on Tessa's shoulder, both of them glowing with the kind of confidence only people who believe they'll never face consequences have. That glow was gone now, and I didn't have to lift a finger. The box had done the talking. I stood by the railing watching the tide come in. The water moved the way truth does. Slowly, relentlessly. It never asks permission to rise. That night, the news stopped whispering. It began to roar. Margaret's call came just after 10. "The federal auditors are on site," she said. "They showed up at the company's headquarters this evening." He didn't see it coming. I pictured Gerald sitting behind that mahogany desk of his, surrounded by glass awards and framed photos from galas, watching strangers in dark suits walk through his empire with clipboards and quiet authority. Men like him never imagine the rules applying to them. Until they do. By midnight, every financial publication in Charleston and Palm Beach had the same headline: "Whitlock Development under federal investigation." It was followed by subheadings about forged authorizations, trust fund misuse, and potential criminal liability. This wasn't just gossip anymore. It was a story with legs, and stories like this don't walk. They sprint. I scrolled through the coverage with a steady hand. The photos they used were carefully chosen. Gerald at black tie events, smiling with politicians, Tessa standing beside him like an ornament polished for display. They looked untouchable in those images. But beneath every perfect photograph was a line of text outlining their cracks. Social media moved faster than the newspapers. Within hours, their names were trending locally. Anonymous sources, past business partners, people who had always known something but never said a word. They were all talking now. Margaret sent me a copy of the court filing, 73 pages, every signature, every forged document, every wire transfer. My name, once the invisible lifeline of their empire, was now the blade cutting it apart. The audit reports were sealed but not silent. In Charleston, nothing stays hidden once the money starts bleeding. She also told me that Tessa had tried to use her personal account to withdraw what was left of her wedding fund. It had been frozen. The trust she had taken for granted was no longer her safety net. Tessa had always been wrapped in silk and certainty. That certainty was gone. I imagined her sitting in her perfectly decorated bedroom staring at her phone as the reality she'd never had to understand finally arrived. The next alert came from a live feed. Local news trucks had parked outside the Whitlock estate. Their headlights cut through the darkness like judgment. Reporters stood near the gate, voices hushed but firm, recounting the details of the financial scandal. I saw the house on the screen, the house I had left with nothing but a box, and my freedom. It didn't look invincible anymore. It looked exposed. For years, Gerald had controlled every narrative, every dinner, every deal, every whispered word about the Whitlocks in Charleston high society. He had the kind of presence that made people look down instead of through him. But no one bows to a man under investigation. They look straight at him, and they talk. "And—" Margaret's voice softened for a moment. "You did the right thing," she said. "You didn't burn anything down. You just opened the windows and let the light in." I didn't respond right away. My hands were steady, but my chest ached in a way that wasn't pain. It was release. The most surreal moment came just before dawn. A photo popped up online. Gerald standing outside the gate facing a row of reporters, his jaw locked tight. Tessa behind him in a wrinkled silk blouse, her face drained of the easy confidence she'd worn all her life. The caption was brutal. Control cracks under pressure. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I just stared at the image and breathed. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about truth existing in daylight. For so many years, he had told me that family meant obedience, that love meant silence, that strength meant paying for everyone else's mistakes. But the truth had a different shape. In Nantucket, the sun was rising over the water, pale gold and quiet. I closed the laptop and stood by the window. For the first time in decades, I wasn't waiting for his voice to decide the shape of my life. His empire was crumbling under its own weight. All I had done was step aside and let it fall. The fall didn't come as a single crash. It came in waves, slow at first, then brutal. 3 days after the investigation broke, Margaret called again. This time, she didn't sound sharp or urgent. She sounded precise, like someone reading a verdict. The board voted, she said. "He's out." I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The sentence was enough. Gerald Whitlock, the man who built his life on the illusion of control, was no longer chairman of Whitlock Development. The company he treated like an extension of his voice had shut the door on him. That was the first wave. I sat on the porch in Nantucket, the air smelling like salt and pine, and watched seagulls glide over the gray water. My phone buzzed with a constant rhythm, alerts, headlines, updates, each one peeling another layer off the empire that had once seemed so permanent. I opened one article, a photo of Gerald in a dark suit leaving the company headquarters, surrounded by cameras, his jaw, tight eyes narrow. The caption read, "Whitlock removed as chairman amid federal probe." The second wave hit that afternoon. The bank issued its statement. All accounts linked to Gerald and the company were under extended audit and temporary freeze. No assets could be moved. No funds could be hidden. The same system he had weaponized against everyone else now boxed him in like an animal cornered by his own fence. I imagined him standing in that study holding his phone as the banker explained calmly and clinically that his signature no longer had power. Gerald had always spoken with the certainty of someone who believed paper and money would always bend to his will. Now the paper belonged to someone else. Tessa called me. The number flashed on the screen for a long time before I picked up. The silence on the line was thick, unrecognizable. Gone was the silk in her voice. Gone was the practiced sweetness. "Alara." She said, her voice small. "They froze everything." She said it like she was telling me the sky had fallen. For her, it had. "I can't even access the account for the florist," she whispered. She wasn't talking about justice. She wasn't talking about consequences. She was talking about a wedding that would never happen. I didn't say anything. For years, my voice had been a net for her to land on. Now it was just air. She tried again. "You can fix this. You always fix things." There was no venom this time, no arrogance. Just fear. And for a brief moment, I felt something stir in me. Not pity, not satisfaction, something quieter. The soft ache of recognizing the weight of someone finally colliding with reality. But I didn't step in. I let the silence do what it needed to do. The third wave came that night. Tessa's fiancé, the man with the perfectly tailored suits and the perfect last name, released a statement through his family's spokesperson. "In light of the ongoing legal issues surrounding the Whitlock family, we regret to announce the postponement of the wedding and a re-evaluation of future plans." It was the clean, bloodless way wealthy people sever ties when things turn toxic. I read the statement twice. Each word was a quiet blade. Tessa had always believed her world would never crack. But wealth is loyal to power, not people. And when power crumbles, wealth looks away. I lay awake in bed that night listening to the wind scrape against the windows. Gerald had spent years making the world smaller for me. He had closed doors, shaped narratives, held the strings. But as I stared into the dark, I realized something he probably still hadn't. Control doesn't disappear when someone leaves. It rots from the inside the moment it's questioned. He had lost control the second I walked away with nothing but a suitcase and a wooden box. In the morning, new photos surfaced. Gerald leaving a courthouse. The cameras caught him mid-step, shoulders stiff. A man trying to pretend the ground wasn't shaking. He had spent his life controlling how others saw him. Now the lens belonged to someone else. The same people who used to shake his hand at fundraisers were turning their faces away. In high society, ruin spreads faster than gossip. Margaret texted me a single line. "It's happening exactly the way we planned." And for the first time in years, I let myself smile. Not because he was suffering, but because for once the truth wasn't buried beneath his voice. It was standing in daylight. The fourth wave came without ceremony. It was a quiet press release from the federal court clerk's office. Formal charges under review, potential counts of financial fraud, forgery, and coercion tied to trust mismanagement. The words were clinical, stripped of emotion, but to me they read like a final door closing behind Gerald Whitlock. By noon, every news outlet from Charleston to Palm Beach carried the same headline. The story was no longer local scandal. It had become national. A man who once built his image on marble and money was now a name in a case file. I sat at a cafe near the harbor, the breeze cool against my skin, watching the words scroll across the screen. Margaret called again. She didn't sound triumphant. She sounded exact. "He can't touch a dollar without triggering a compliance alert now. The board is cooperating fully. He's done." Her voice held the weight of finality. She told me something else, then quieter. "It's strange. Men like him are always so loud until the law takes away their microphone." I thought of his voice echoing through that house, his footsteps against marble floors, the way the walls used to bend to his presence. Now all of it belonged to someone else. The fifth wave hit Tessa first. Her world had always been made of glass and applause. That morning, the glossy wedding blog she adored published their own take on the collapse. Palm Beach wedding of the season canceled amid scandal. The comment sections were brutal. Former friends who had once lined up to be photographed with her now acted like they'd never known her at all. Her designer lifestyle had been built on Gerald's power. And Gerald's power was bleeding out fast. The bank took possession of the Palm Beach property that had been meant to host her wedding. The caterers pulled out. The event planner removed her name from the calendar. In a matter of hours, what was once a carefully constructed fantasy crumbled into nothing but receipts. I didn't need to call her to know she was crying. For years, she had watched me hold up the weight of their choices. She had never imagined that weight could fall on her. But it had. I wasn't cruel enough to celebrate her pain. I wasn't soft enough to carry it either. She had built her world on borrowed ground. The ground had shifted. Gerald, on the other hand, faced a quieter kind of storm. He tried to return to the country club he'd treated like his throne for 2 decades. Someone filmed him at the entrance speaking to the receptionist while members walked past without looking at him. The video went viral by evening. It wasn't the words that mattered. It was the silence around him, the absence of the deference he had lived on. It hollowed him out more effectively than any headline ever could. I watched that clip 3 times, not with glee, with clarity. This was what the end of control looked like. Not fire, not noise. Just a man alone in a place where no one bowed anymore. Margaret sent me the final confirmation the next morning. The company officially transferred leadership to the vice chair. Gerald was out permanently. No ceremonial exit, no farewell. Just a line in a document removing his name from everything he built on lies. His accounts remained frozen. His influence vanished. I walked down to the beach, letting the cold sand press into my feet. The waves rolled in slow and certain. There's a kind of silence that isn't empty. It's clean. I closed my eyes and listened. For so long, my life had been shaped by the sound of his voice. Now it was shaped by the absence of it. Power built on fear always looks unshakable until someone stops being afraid. And when it falls, it doesn't ask for permission. It simply ends. When the storm finally passed, what surprised me most was the quiet. No more phone calls I didn't want to answer. No more sharp footsteps echoing down marble halls. No more weight pressed against my chest every time I checked my bank account. Just silence. I spent the first few weeks in Nantucket learning how to breathe without permission. The cottage I rented wasn't grand. It had creaky floors, salt-stained windows, and a small porch that looked out onto the water. But every inch of it belonged to me. No one's name hovered above the door. No one could tell me to stay or leave. The mornings became a ritual. I would wake up early when the light was soft and the tide still low and make a cup of black coffee. The world outside would be half-asleep fishermen heading out, gulls gliding low over the water. I'd stand on the porch in my sweater and let the wind wrap around me. I used to think freedom would feel like fire, but it felt like this: slow, gentle, unapologetically mine. I started walking every afternoon down to the harbor. There was a path that cut through wild grass and led to a wooden bench near the dunes. I sat there for hours sometimes watching the water shift colors with the sky. For years, I had lived inside someone else's rhythm. Now my heartbeat finally belonged to me. A few weeks after arriving, Margaret visited. She stepped off the ferry wearing her usual tailored coat and an expression that mixed professional calm with something softer. She had been my shield in the legal storm, but she was also the first person who looked at me and didn't see a lifeline to be exploited. Over dinner at a small dockside restaurant, she told me the last piece of news I hadn't asked for but knew was coming. They finalized the removal, she said. "He's done. It's over, Alara." The way she said it felt different. Final. I nodded, stirring my tea. "And Tessa?" "She's adjusting," Margaret said carefully. I could tell she was choosing her words with surgical precision. "She's not used to the world without a net." I looked out at the harbor at the reflection of the pier lights shimmering on the water. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't need to. Justice doesn't always sound like applause. Sometimes it's just the sound of the world finally leaving you alone. After Margaret left, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I walked into the local community center and offered to volunteer. They were running financial literacy workshops for women trying to rebuild their lives after leaving controlling relationships. I stood in front of 10 strangers that first night, my palms damp, my voice low. I wasn't there as a victim. I wasn't there as the woman who took down a powerful man. I was just someone who had lived through the quiet erosion of self and made it out the other side. I told them about control that hides behind family dinners and polite conversations, about money that becomes a leash when someone else holds the account. I didn't use Gerald's name. I didn't have to. They recognized the story in their own eyes. After the session, a woman with silver hair squeezed my hand and whispered, "Thank you for saying it out loud." Her voice was thin but steady. I felt something in me shift again, this time not breaking. Healing. Days turned into weeks. I learned to cook simple meals again. I read books I'd bought years ago but never opened. I let my hair grow out in the wind, salt-streaked and unbothered. I stopped dressing for anyone's expectations. I started writing down pieces of my story, not for a courtroom or a lawyer, but for myself. Every so often, the world outside reminded me that Gerald's fall was still echoing. Articles, gossip, board decisions. But those echoes were no longer mine to carry. They belonged to the empire he built and lost. My name wasn't on those headlines anymore. My life was here, on this island, in this moment. One morning, I stood ankle-deep in the cold surf, the wind biting at my skin, and realized something simple and extraordinary. I wasn't waiting for the next command, for the next demand, for the next invisible weight. I was standing still, and the world wasn't closing in. I rented a small office space above a bakery and started consulting again on my own terms. Not for Gerald, not for anyone who saw me as an asset they could own. Just clients I chose. Work that didn't drain me. Every contract had my name, my terms, my boundaries. I thought it would feel small compared to the scale of what I used to manage. It didn't. It felt right. Sometimes at night, I walked down to the pier and listened to the ocean. The same darkness that used to feel suffocating in Charleston now felt clean, like air I hadn't realized I'd been starving for. Freedom isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet sound of water moving against the shore. People in the community started to know me by name, not as Gerald Whitlock's stepdaughter, not as the woman who financed someone else's life, just Alara. A woman who lived near the harbor, drank too much coffee, and never missed the sunrise. There were moments when the past flickered. I'd hear a voice that sounded like his in a crowd. I'd see a man in a navy suit and feel my stomach clench before my mind caught up. But each time the feeling passed a little faster. Each time the ghosts got quieter. On the 50th day since I left Charleston, I sat on my porch as the fog lifted from the water. The tide was rolling in slow, steady, unbothered. I wrapped my hands around a mug of coffee and whispered to myself, "You're here. You made it." It wasn't a grand declaration. It was the truth, plain and simple. I had spent most of my life building walls around someone else's castle. Now I was building a small home that didn't need walls to feel safe. And in that quiet morning light, for the first time in decades, I didn't feel like someone's property. I felt like a woman standing on her own ground. The call came on a gray morning when the tide was low and the harbor was wrapped in mist. I was sitting at the small wooden table in my kitchen, tracing the rim of my coffee mug, when the phone vibrated against the wood. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Most days I did, but something in the stillness of that moment made me answer. Alara. His voice was quieter than I remembered. No weight, no command. Just a man trying to remember how to speak without being obeyed. For a heartbeat, the years folded back, and I saw the study, the marble, the way his voice used to fill every corner of my life. Then the image dissolved. He breathed in slowly on the other end, like someone rehearsing a line. I'm not calling to ask for anything, he said. The fact that he needed to clarify that was almost poetic. Gerald Whitlock had built a lifetime on asking without asking. I said nothing. The silence stretched long enough for him to feel it. He cleared his throat. I wanted to tell you. I understand now. His voice broke on the last word, not dramatically, just enough to sound human. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the fog thickening outside the window. Understand what I asked. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. That I never owned anything he said. Not the company, not the house, not you. I thought control was love. I thought if I built a fortress, no one could leave me. I let the words settle like dust on an old table. There was a time when hearing something like that would have cracked me open. But now, they were just words. Late, but honest. You didn't build a fortress, I said softly. You built a cage. And then, you locked yourself inside with us. He exhaled slowly. I watched them take everything, the house, the company, even the way people look at me. I thought I'd be angry, but all I feel is empty. I could hear the wind on his end of the line, a faint, hollow sound, like a man standing outside a house that no longer belonged to him. For the first time, his silence didn't feel like something pressing against my chest. It was his burden now, not mine. He tried again, his voice catching on the edges. You were the only one who ever stood up to me. I didn't see it then. I thought you were ungrateful. I see it now. I let out a slow breath. I didn't stand up to you for you, Gerald. I did it for me. I know, he said, and you were right to. His voice cracked, then quiet and rough. Do you ever think about forgiveness? I closed my eyes, listening to the gulls outside calling through the fog. Forgiveness. A word so many people like him use as a shortcut to ease their guilt. Forgiveness isn't something you get because you ask for it, I said. It's something that grows in the space where you stop expecting it. The line went silent for a moment. I could hear his breath. It was strange to realize how human it sounded now, stripped of its power. I don't expect anything from you, he whispered. I just needed to hear your voice once without you being afraid of me. I swallowed hard. Not because I pitied him, because for the first time I heard the cost of his own walls. Then you've heard it, I said. There was a pause, long and fragile. Then he laughed softly. It wasn't bitter, just tired. I used to think I could buy loyalty, but I never realized silence was the most expensive thing of all. Yours cost me everything. I stood up and walked to the porch, letting the cold air meet my face. The ocean was just visible through the fog, a soft silver stretch without edges. You took years from me, I said quietly, but I took the rest of them back. That's the difference. He didn't argue. Maybe for once in his life he had nothing left to win. I hope. His voice caught. I hope you keep what's yours. I closed my eyes and let the words land without sticking. Goodbye, Gerald. He didn't try to stop me. The line clicked softly, and then it was just the wind again. I stood on the porch for a long time after that, the phone still warm in my hand. The conversation didn't heal anything. It wasn't meant to. It was a line drawn in the sand. For years, his voice had been the first and last sound in every battle. Now, it was just another sound carried away by the wind. And that was enough. The morning after the call, the world was still and bright. The fog that had wrapped itself around the harbor for days finally lifted, revealing the horizon like a secret that had been waiting patiently. I stepped onto the porch with a mug of black coffee barefoot against the cool wood and watched the tide slide in. The sun had just begun to rise, painting the water in pale gold. For the first time in years, I didn't brace myself for anything. There was nothing to defend, nothing to calculate, nothing to survive. Just air, just light, just me. I walked down the path to the sand and let the cold water brush my feet. The Atlantic felt sharper in the morning, as if it wanted to remind you it was alive. The wind tangled through my hair, wild and unapologetic. I closed my eyes and breathed in the salt. It wasn't just a new day. It was a life I had chosen on my own terms. For so many years, my story had belonged to someone else, to a man who measured love in obedience, to a family that used my silence like currency. I had built walls to keep their chaos contained, not realizing those same walls had trapped me inside. But standing there with the sea licking at my toes and the light spilling across the water, I knew those walls no longer existed. Freedom didn't arrive as a roar. It arrived as a whisper. In the quiet way the wind curved around my body without asking for permission. In the way my name no longer echoed against marble, but dissolved into the open air. People like Gerald believe control is permanent, but control is a loan, and the moment the person being controlled stops paying interest, everything collapses. I had stopped paying, and he had watched his empire unravel in silence. But this wasn't his ending. This was mine. I turned back toward the cottage. The paint was chipped, the porch creaked, and the windows whistled on windy nights. But every inch of it was mine. No inherited expectations, no debts wrapped in family language, just space I built for myself. On the table inside lay a stack of notebooks I'd started filling over the past month. Not legal files, not evidence, just stories, fragments of my life I wanted to keep on my own terms. The first page read in uneven handwriting. This time, the ending belongs to me. Later that morning, I walked to the community center for the Saturday workshop. The air smelled of fresh bread from the bakery below the office I'd rented. 10 women waited in the room, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and flickering hope. I recognized their expressions. I'd worn them once too. I spoke about power, about control, dressed up as love, about money that becomes a chain if you let someone else hold the key. But more than anything, I spoke about leaving. Not the dramatic part, but the quiet part after, the rebuilding, the claiming. When the session ended, one of the women, her hands still trembling from something she hadn't told anyone, yet asked me, "Does it ever stop hurting?" I didn't lie. "It doesn't vanish?" I said softly. But one day, the pain stops owning the room. One day, it just becomes a piece of the story instead of the whole book. She nodded, and something in her eyes shifted. Not healed, but beginning. I knew that look. It was the same way the sun had broken through the fog this morning. Quiet. Relentless. That night, I sat by the window with the tide high and the wind warm. I thought of Gerald not as the man who had tried to control me, but as the man who no longer could. I thought of Tessa learning what it meant to stand without a net. And I thought of myself not as the woman who left, but as the woman who arrived. I took out the small wooden box I'd carried with me when I left Charleston, the same box I'd used to end everything. Inside, the papers were still neat, the USB untouched. But this time, I wasn't holding evidence. I was holding a reminder of the night I chose myself, Of the moment I walked into the dark and found out it wasn't waiting to swallow me. It was waiting to set me free. I placed the box back on the shelf and opened the window wider. The night air slipped in like an old friend. For years, I thought freedom would mean forgetting. But now I understand it means remembering and choosing differently. It means building a life where no one else gets to hold the pen. The sea outside whispered against the rocks, steady and calm. I whispered back, "I'm still here." And then I smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because for the first time in my life, the story was mine. If you've ever had to choose between family and freedom, if you've ever stood in the doorway with your heart pounding and your future waiting, tell me your story. Because this isn't just mine. It belongs to anyone who's ever learned to walk away.